The words cut through the air like a blade. Go back to India. For a heartbeat, the studio froze. The panelists mid-breath. The cameras locked in place. The audience somewhere between a gasp and dead silence. Kash Patel didn't flinch. His eyes held steady, not with shock, but with the kind of quiet resolve that can unnerve an opponent more than any outburst ever could. The overhead lights bore down in harsh white, casting sharp shadows across the debate desk. Every camera in the room seemed to lean toward him, hungry to catch the next micro-expression, the next tell. The producer's voice, tight with urgency, crackled in the earpieces of the crew. Stay on him. Stay on him. Viewers at home didn't need the direction. They could feel it. Something was coming. Levitt sat back in her chair, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her lips, as if she'd just landed the knockout blow. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably, their body language betraying a collective sense that a line had been crossed. Even the host, trained to navigate the choppy waters of live political confrontation, seemed momentarily caught off guard, his prepared questions evaporating into the tension now swallowing the set. The soundstage carried its own electricity, the hum of studio lights, the faint rattle of a camera rig as an operator leaned in for the close-up, the whispered exchanges among audience members who couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Outside these walls, the country was already splitting into factions on social media, clips being clipped, captions being written, outrage and defense both revving their engines. Patel's hands rested calmly on the desk, fingertips together, gaze fixed on Levitt. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it hang there, a mirror forcing the room to confront itself. In those few, suspended seconds, the insult echoed, not as a question of his origin, but as a challenge to the very definition of belonging. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouthed, "Oh my God," as the red tally light on camera 2 stayed, locked on Patel's face. America was watching. America was waiting. And the stillness before his words felt like the edge of a storm. But no one in that room, or across America, was ready for what came next. Long before the insult echoed under the bright studio lights, America had been wrestling with deeper questions about who belongs, who decides, and what it means to call this country home. The debate that night wasn't just another panel, squabble. It was a flashpoint in a broader cultural storm. Immigration was once again the lightning rod in a polarized nation, with every soundbite feeding a narrative that seemed to fracture the very idea of us. Outside the studio walls, the air was thick with headlines about border policies, citizenship tests, and loyalty oaths. Commentators lined up on both sides of the political spectrum, each armed with their own statistics, their own stories, their own carefully sharpened talking points. To some, the promise of America was being stretched too thin. To others, the very soul of the nation was at stake if it turned its back on the people who had built their lives here through sacrifice and grit. Kash Patel's presence on that panel symbolized more than just another pundit weighing in. His resume carried the weight of service at the highest levels of national security, his personal story woven from threads of immigration, assimilation, and perseverance. For millions watching, his voice represented an idea they wanted desperately to believe, that identity and patriotism were not in conflict, that you could honor your roots while giving your all to the country you call home. And yet, across the table sat Caroline Levitt, embodying a different narrative. For her supporters, bluntness was a virtue, even when it scorched the air. Her record on immigration had always been framed in absolutes, her rhetoric wrapped in the belief that American identity was something narrow, guarded and exclusive. Every word she spoke that night was a signal flare to those who believed the gates should be higher, the drawbridge pulled up. That's what made her outburst so combustible. It wasn't just a personal jab, it was a declaration, a reassertion of a worldview that millions had been told was fading, but that still burned hot in certain corners of the country. The insult landed in the middle of a conversation already teetering on the edge, and in that instant, The stakes leapt from the table to the nation's collective conscience. Viewers weren't just deciding whether to take offense, they were deciding what kind of country they wanted their children to inherit. In the minutes after her words, Twitter feeds erupted like wildfire, outrage trending side by side with smug applause. Hashtags began to form, some calling for her censure, others turning the insult into a rallying cry. Cable news Chiron producers were already drafting headlines they knew would loop for days. But back in the studio, amidst the glare and the heat, all eyes were on Patel. His silence wasn't passive, it was an overt act of composure. Those who knew the rhythm of political theatre could feel it. He wasn't just going to respond, he was going to flip the entire exchange, turn it from a personal slight into a defining moment that would ricochet far beyond that night's debate. The atmosphere had shifted. The smirk on Levitt's face was still there, but the balance of control in the room had tilted. Somewhere, instinctively, the audience sensed they were about to witness one of those rare live TV reversals, the kind replayed on timelines, in classrooms and in campaign ads for years to come. And then, with the nation holding its breath, he began to speak. Carolina Levitt's political journey was anything but accidental. Born and raised in a small New England town, she cultivated an image early, sharp-tongued, unapologetic, and fiercely aligned with a brand of politics that prized confrontation as much as conviction. To her supporters, she was a rising star, unafraid to challenge the so-called elites. To her critics, she embodied the very arrogance and exclusion she claimed to oppose. Her first brush with political relevance came not from holding office, but from mastering the rhythms of media combat. Straight out of college, she navigated her way into communications roles where she learned that in the modern political arena, outrage wasn't a byproduct, it was currency. This early schooling in the mechanics of message control, combined with a knack for turning insult into spectacle, set the stage for her rapid ascent. By the time she began appearing regularly on national panels, Levitt had perfected her rhetorical style. Sharp, interruptive, and loaded with phrases designed to ignite her base while provoking outrage from opponents. She framed herself as a truth-teller in an age of political correctness, wearing accusations of offensiveness like badges of honor. The more critics accused her of crossing the line, the more she insisted she was exposing what others were too afraid to say. But beneath the cultivated image of principled bluntness were contradictions that her detractors pounced on. She spoke passionately about American unity, while endorsing policies that drew stark lines between real Americans and those she saw as outsiders. She championed personal responsibility, yet frequently deflected blame when her own words backfired, blaming media distortion or political witch hunts. Several controversies paved the way for the moment in the studio that night. There was the town hall where she dismissed a question from a naturalized citizen about voting rights with a curt, "Learn the rules before you play the game." There was the podcast appearance where she suggested, half smiling into the camera, that English should be a mandatory requirement for public office, adding pointedly, "If you want to lead here, speak like you're from here." Each incident ignited fury among immigrant communities, and each time she leveraged the backlash to bolster her narrative of being the victim of an overly sensitive culture. Her talent for surviving these firestorms was undeniable. She understood that in the 24-hour outrage cycle, resilience wasn't about avoiding controversy, but about controlling its aftermath. Each uproar became an opportunity to appear on sympathetic media, repeating her core themes: strength, tradition, and a narrowly defined patriotism, until the storm passed. In her telling, every condemnation was proof of her courage, and yet there were cracks in the armor. Off-the-cuff remarks occasionally revealed more than she intended. Former colleagues recalled moments when her unfiltered persona wasn't so much calculated as it was impulsive. Flashes of irritation toward those who disagreed with her, impatience with nuanced debate, and an instinct to personalize political disagreements. It was in those moments, they said, that the line between performance and belief blurred, that blurring mattered. Because the "go back to India" outburst wasn't a rehearsed talking point. It wasn't part of a prepared set of zingers meant to score cable news replay value. It came from somewhere unpolished, unstrategized, a raw reflex in a high-pressure exchange. For supporters, it might still be dressed up as speaking her mind. For detractors, it confirmed what they'd always suspected, that beneath the veneer of patriotic fervor lay something uglier. Something that viewed Americanness as a heritage to be guarded, not an ideal to be shared. Her rise had always depended on owning the room, talking over, pressing harder, never yielding ground. In countless interviews, she'd pivoted from moments of weakness by launching counterattacks, reframing herself as the one under siege. But the dynamics in that studio were different. The insult didn't fluster Patel, it sharpened the focus on him. Suddenly, the exchange wasn't about her mastery of the moment, but about what her words revealed to everyone watching. It's not that she hadn't faced formidable opponents before. She had. And in most of those encounters, her combination of speed and aggression carried her through. But this time, she was dealing with someone whose life story directly contradicted the exclusion she was asserting. Someone whose resume was built on service to the very country she claimed to be defending. That contrast was about to strip her usual tactics of their force. And so, while she sat there with that faint, satisfied smirk, the calculus was shifting. The audience, in the studio and at home, wasn't just absorbing a political jab, they were measuring character. Some saw defiance in her words, others saw a mask slipping. In that silence after the outburst, the oxygen in the room seemed to turn toward Patel, as if the weight of the next moment belonged entirely to him. But her opponent's story was forged in a very different fire. Kash Patel's story began, long before the lights of television studios and the sharp edges of political debates. It began with a family's leap of faith, parents who left the familiar rhythms of their homeland for the uncertainty of a distant shore. They carried with them little more than determination, a belief in education, and a quiet conviction that in America, the work of your hands and the strength of your word could carve out a place in the world. Growing up, Patel straddled two worlds. At home, the scent of his mother's cooking and the cadence of family stories kept his roots alive. Outside, he navigated the swirl of suburban America, learning early how to blend, adapt, and excel without surrendering the pieces of himself that tied him to his heritage. His parents instilled in him the discipline of preparation and the dignity of restraint. Lessons learned not from books, but from the way they faced each day with uncomplaining resolve. Academics became his bridge. He studied hard not to prove his worth to those who doubted him, but because his parents had sacrificed too much for him to do otherwise. That drive carried him through college and into law school, where he found his calling in service rather than self-promotion. Law was, for him, not merely a profession, but a mechanism, a way to defend those without power, to uphold the architecture of justice that was meant to shelter every citizen, regardless of origin. His early legal work brought him face to face with the raw edges of the system, clients clinging to their rights against long odds, cases where the truth wasn't neatly aligned with convenience. He learned to stand his ground in courtrooms where the air could turn hostile, where the easy path was compromise, and the right one demanded patience and spine. But his trajectory didn't stop at the courtroom door. Patel's skill, discretion, and refusal to bend to political expediency caught the attention of those in Washington who valued integrity over flash. He was drawn into national security roles, where the stakes weren't headlines, but lives. Behind the walls of briefings and classified files, he worked the delicate line between protecting the nation and protecting the principles that defined it. This wasn't the kind of service that came with applause. It was the grind of long nights, the burden of decisions where every option carried weight. Patel earned a reputation for clarity under pressure. The person in the room who could absorb the noise, strip away the ego, and focus on what the law and the mission demanded. His colleagues knew him as someone who respected authority but would not be cowed by it. A man who could disagree without disrespect, and who understood that the strength of America came from both its might and its ideals. Along the way, the jabs at his identity never fully disappeared. Sometimes they were open, careless words in a heated exchange. Other times they were veiled, coated in condescension, tucked between compliments. He absorbed them with the same steady calm, not because they didn't sting, but because he recognized that anger, uncontrolled, often gave your opponent exactly what they wanted. Instead, he chose to answer with competence, with facts, and with the quiet assurance that his service spoke louder than any insult. Those who knew Patel well described a man who could be warm in private but reserved in the public eye, not aloof, but measured. He didn't chase the limelight, though it often found him, and when it did, he understood the responsibility that came with it, that his words could affirm the worth of people who saw themselves reflected in him, and that his example could challenge the narrow definitions of Americanness still clung to by some. By the time he took his seat opposite Caroline Leavitt that night, Patel carried with him not just a resume, but a lifetime of moments that had honed him for exactly this kind of test. He had argued before skeptical judges, briefed wary senior officials, and navigated negotiations where every misstep could carry international consequences. He had faced voices that tried to diminish his belonging, and still managed to channel the best of the country back at them: patience, reason, and unwavering dignity. To the progressive-leaning, immigrant-proud viewers in the audience, Patel's presence at that desk was validation in itself. Here was someone who had walked the path they or their families had walked. A child of immigrants who had reached the upper tiers of service, not by diluting his identity, but by embracing the full span of it. His success wasn't an exception. It was proof of what the promise of America at its best could deliver. It was also why the insult hurled at him landed so viscerally with those watching. They understood, in their bones, that it was bigger than one man. It was about who gets to be from here, about whether service, sacrifice, and allegiance can be erased by a single sentence. In Patel's calm after the words, they recognized not passivity, but readiness. The same readiness that had carried him through years of scrutiny and challenge. He wasn't just sitting there to defend himself. He was sitting there to remind the country what it claimed to stand for. To show, without shouting, that dignity is not weakness, and that sometimes the strongest rebuttal begins with stillness. And those values were about to be tested in front of millions. The minutes before the insult were a masterclass in contrasts. The moderator had posed a question about immigration reform, not in abstract policy terms, but in the context of loyalty and identity. Leavitt seized it as her opening, leaning forward in her chair, voice taut with conviction, her words rolling out like precision-dropped charges. She painted a picture of a country on the brink, traditions eroded, and culture under siege. Patel listened, his expression unreadable, a subtle tilt of the head betraying only that he was processing each point in turn. When his turn came, he began not with an attack, but with a story. A legal case he'd worked on defending the rights of an immigrant family, a case that ended not in partisan victory, but in a child reuniting with their parents. The tone was calm, factual, yet threaded with a quiet insistence that policy was about lives, not slogans. Leavitt cut in before he'd finished. "That's a nice anecdote, Cash, but we're talking about preserving the character of the nation, not feel-good exceptions." Her interruption was sharp, her smile rehearsed for the camera. Patel didn't take the bait. "The character of a nation," he replied evenly, "is defined by how it treats the people who stand under its flag." The exchange became a volley. She would strike with a sweeping generalization. He would counter with a specific, grounded fact. Each time he dismantled a point, her tone grew a notch more brittle. "You're dodging the issue," she accused at one point, gesturing toward him as if to underline her words. He simply folded his hands and said, "I'm addressing it. I'm just not reducing it to a caricature." The audience in the studio, felt the shift. What began as Levitt's confident charge was turning into a series of small retreats. Her talking points, so effective in friendly interviews, were meeting the quiet resistance of someone unwilling to be rushed into a corner. She spoke faster, perhaps sensing she was losing the rhythm, while Patel's pace remained unhurried, almost surgical. A question about national service brought the clearest crack yet. Patel described his years in national security, the compromises he'd refused to make when they clashed with constitutional principles. Serving America, he said, isn't about where your grandparents were born. It's about the oath you take and whether you live by it. The line drew a murmur of approval from parts of the audience. Levitt leaned in again, her voice tightening. And yet, you think open borders? I think integrity matters more than fear, Patel interjected, not with volume, but with finality. It was the first time all evening he'd stepped on her words, and the effect was palpable. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Then came the visible recalibration. Shoulders back, chin high, a smile that didn't touch her eyes. She began to repeat a well-worn line about protecting real Americans, but the phrase snagged in her delivery. The frustration was no longer subtle. It was coiling beneath her composure, waiting for release. She gestured toward him, palm open, in a show of exasperation. People like you just don't get, she started, then stopped herself, shaking, her head with a quick laugh that sounded more defensive than amused. Patel met her gaze without blinking. He wasn't smirking, he wasn't leaning back. He was steady, occupying his space fully without expanding it. It was the posture of a man who knew that his silence, at the right moment, could be louder than any retort. The moderator, sensing the rising temperature, tried to steer them toward economic policy, but the detour lasted less than a minute before. Levitt looped the conversation back to immigration, her sentences coming faster, the edges less polished. We can't just hand this country over to, she began, catching herself again mid-phrase. It was then, in the narrowing space between her frustration and his stillness, that something seemed to snap. Her voice sharpened, volume ticking, upward. She launched into a sentence about cultural fit and knowing where you belong. The words pressed harder, like she was driving them through an unseen barricade. The veneer of strategic messaging thinned until only raw sentiment showed through. Patel didn't move. He let her fill the air, the studio lights catching the faint sheen of effort on her brow. The more she pushed, the more his calm became its own counter-argument, a mirror reflecting the imbalance growing between them. And then came the moment that would define the night. Patel drew a breath, not to cool his anger, but to hold the room. He began softly, every syllable deliberate. You told me to go back to India, he said, and for a moment, the insult hung like smoke. I will answer you as an American. My parents came here for the promise that law outranks lineage. They believed this country measures worth by oaths kept, not by surnames pronounced. I have taken that oath. I have honored it. And I'm still here, not as your exception, but as your equal. That is the first and last answer you need tonight. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic, he continued, and that oath did not include a footnote about where my grandparents were born. It did, however, demand that I protect the dignity of every person protected by that same Constitution. That includes you. That includes me. It includes the families you reduce to headlines and the soldiers whose names you invoke. Our flag is not a purity test. It is a promise kept in public, not whispered behind gates, but lived in daylight together. You talk about belonging like it is a gate you control. Belonging in America is not yours to grant or deny. It is an agreement we make with each other and with the law. I earned my place the same way millions did, by work, service, and faith in a country big enough for contradiction. If you need a label for me, use American. If you need a hyphen, know this. My oath had no hyphen, my duty had no asterisk, and my love of country never asked your permission. It stood up when invited to sit down and stayed. You told me to go back. I won't, because I never left. My family sowed roots in soil they watered with night shifts and morning prayers, and those roots hold firm. I can visit the land of my ancestors with honor and still belong here without apology. That is not a contradiction. It is the American arrangement. You think the insult reduces me. It reduces you. It shrinks your vision of this country to something brittle and afraid, where heritage is a wall instead of a window. I refuse that. I refuse smallness from anyone who claims to love America. I served alongside people named Johnson, Nguyen, Garcia, Singh, O'Malley, and Lee. We argued, we laughed, we disagreed, and we kept faith with the mission. In secure rooms, without cameras, no one asked for proof of origin. They asked for competence and courage. When the stakes were high, no one demanded a purity test. They demanded results that protected the public. If you want to measure Americanness, measure the willingness to shoulder responsibility when there is no applause and to tell the truth when it costs. That is the measure. Everything else is costume, and cameras eventually catch costumes off. He paused, letting the room consider the terms. A soft murmur rolled through the seats, the sound of people recognizing a line they would repeat later. Levitt inhaled as if to pounce, but he continued, never rushing. I'm not offended for myself, he said. I'm disappointed for what you're willing to make small. You speak of strength and tradition, while treating both like fragile ornaments that shatter at the sound of a different accent. Strength does not fear a neighbor's name. Tradition does not require erasing someone else's. Patriotism does not need a gatekeeper. It needs citizens brave enough to look at me and hear me as a fellow American, not as your foil. I don't need your permission to love this country, but I am offering you an invitation to love it bigger. You can defend borders without shrinking people. You can argue policies without attacking identities. If your case is strong, you never need the shortcut of telling someone to leave. That is not confidence. That is fear trying to sound brave. And it always sounds thin. You don't have to choose that. You can choose courage that includes. America keeps its strength by widening who belongs here. The facts are simple. Immigrants start businesses, pay taxes, serve in uniform, and raise children who become teachers, engineers, first responders, and yes, public servants. They sit across dinner tables in every town you campaign through. You win nothing by telling them to vanish. You lose the future you claim to protect. America has always set hard debates before the people, but it has never become greater by making the circle smaller. Our greatness grows when we demand more from one another, not less, and when we judge by contribution, not ancestry. That is policy with a conscience and spine. If you're watching at home and you've heard those words before, I want you to hear me now. You belong. Your work counts. Your love of this country counts. Your accent, your prayers, your recipes, your grief, your dreams, they all count. No insult can revoke what your life has already pledged. If your child asks what to say when someone tells them to go back, teach them this. Stand up straight. Speak clearly. Tell the truth. And never apologize for standing under a flag you help carry, because it is yours as much as anyone else's, today and always. As for you, here is the mirror you tried to hand me. If your love of country needs me smaller, it was never love, only insecurity in costume. If your argument collapses without an insult, it was never an argument, only noise. You can do better, and this country deserves better. The story of America does not say some arrivals are exile and others are destiny. It says we become us by choosing each other on purpose. Choose better, speak better, debate like the future is listening, because it is, and it remembers who stood tall when it mattered most. He let the silence return, not as retreat, but as verdict. Somewhere a throat cleared, then the sharp intake of breath before sudden applause. Levitt's smile faltered, hardened, then vanished, her eyes flicking to the moderator for rescue that didn't arrive. She tried to interject a statistic, stumbled, and settled for a shrug that read like surrender. Patel nodded once, acknowledging the audience rather than his opponent. The room had felt small a minute earlier. Now it felt larger, as if the walls had moved out to make room for everyone. But the shockwaves didn't stop at the studio doors. It took less than a minute for the first clip to hit Twitter. 15 seconds of silence, Patel's calm voice, and the line that would be repeated across the country before midnight. I never left. Within minutes, hashtags began to detonate across timelines. Never Left surged to the top of trending lists, flanked by Stand with Patel and Americanness Has No Gatekeeper. The studio debate had ended, but online it was only beginning. TikTok feeds filled with stitched reactions, young immigrants wiping away tears, veterans saluting in their kitchens, college students lip-syncing Patel's lines over swelling orchestral tracks. On Instagram, slickly designed quote cards carrying his words spread like wildfire, the same sentence in English, Spanish, Hindi, Tagalog, Arabic. Each share a personal endorsement, a way of saying he spoke for me. Cable news anchors scrambled to catch up with the moment they'd just aired. By the first commercial break after the segment, one network was already running a Chiron reading. Patel's poise stuns debate stage. On another, a visibly animated panelist declared, this was the political equivalent of a walk-off home run. The replay rolled every hour, sometimes slowed to capture the fractional pause before Patel delivered his most cutting lines. By morning, the ripple had reached beyond politics. LeBron James tweeted, dignity, hate, oath, ancestry. That's it. That's the tweet. Mindy Kaling posted a selfie in a t-shirt emblazoned with I never left, adding, wearing this for every kid who's been told otherwise. Even brands joined in, for better or worse. A sneaker company tweeting, run forward, we never left. Meanwhile, Levitt's team went into damage control. Official statements framed her remark as being taken out of context, but the viral energy had already hardened public perception. The full clip didn't soften the blow. If anything, it amplified her visible shift from confidence to discomfort as Patel spoke. Hashtags defending her struggled to gain traction, drowned out by the sheer volume of those celebrating Patel's composure. Political commentators dug deeper, linking Patel's takedown to a lineage of debate moments that shifted momentum. They replayed it alongside historic instances, a senator's pointed question, a civil rights leader's televised rebuttal, casting it as one of those rare times when live TV captures a truth too sharp to dull with spin. At community centres, in immigrant-heavy districts, people huddled over laptops, replaying the segment for friends and family. For many, it wasn't about agreeing with every policy Patel held. It was about seeing a version of themselves unshaken under the lights, answering an insult not with equal fire, but with an unassailable calm that turned the insult inside out. On college campuses, student groups organized impromptu watch parties for those who hadn't seen it yet. In WhatsApp, family threads spanning continents, links shot back and forth with little notes. Look at this. Show the kids. This is how you answer them. In one viral Facebook post, a second-generation Marine veteran wrote, my grandfather was told to go home after Wutu. Patel's words, I wish he'd heard them then. Memes multiplied by the hour. One showed Patel standing in front of the Constitution, the caption reading, no hyphen, no asterisk, no permission needed. Another paired Levitt's frozen reaction with the text. That moment you realize the clip will outlive the campaign. Late-night comedians couldn't resist, weaving Patel's line into monologues that had audiences cheering as much as laughing. In political war rooms, strategists took notes. Patel had demonstrated something rare in the hyper-fractured attention economy, the ability to seize a moment and make it about a principle instead of a personality, to create a soundbite that didn't just go viral but anchored itself in people's sense of fairness. Candidates were already asking their media coaches how to do what Patel did, not realizing that the key was authenticity under pressure, something that can't be focus grouped into existence. Levitt, for her part, doubled down in sympathetic media spaces, framing the exchange as an example of overreaction culture. But each defense only brought Patel's words back into circulation. The algorithm had chosen its hero, and it wasn't letting go. Even those unfamiliar with his career before that night could recite his main points by the weekend. The reach of the moment was quantifiable. Millions of views, tens of thousands of comments. But its deeper impact was less about metrics and more about mood. It shifted the emotional weather in certain communities from weary defensiveness to a flicker of pride. People spoke about the exchange not in terms of winning or losing a debate, but in terms of having witnessed something they could point to, as proof that poise can still cut through the noise. By the end of the week, Patel's words were showing up in places even he might not have predicted. On protest placards, in church sermons, in the captions of wedding photos where the couple came from different continents. The line had escaped the confines of its origin and entered the cultural bloodstream, where it could be reinterpreted, re-owned, and reused for moments far beyond that single debate. And yet, Patel wasn't finished. When the noise of the debate had faded to a steady hush, Patel leaned forward not to press his advantage, but to draw the conversation toward a place no insult could reach. He spoke slowly, with the measured cadence of someone who knew that the meaning was in the space between the words as much as in the words themselves. What happened here tonight, he began, wasn't just about you and me. It was about what we believe America is, and who we believe it's for. His gaze swept the room, pausing on faces both sympathetic and skeptical. I've been told before to go back, and each time I've understood it for what it is. An attempt to make the circle smaller, to decide that belonging is a gift some can give and others can't claim. But belonging in this country is not a favor. It's a covenant. It's written not in ink but in action, in service, in sacrifice, in showing up when you're needed. He spoke of his oath again, but this time not as a personal credential, rather as a universal measure. The truth is, you don't have to serve in uniform or hold public office to keep that oath. You keep it when you help a neighbor, when you defend someone who can't defend themselves, when you tell the truth even when it costs you. Every act of courage, every moment of decency is a signature on that covenant. Patel didn't shy from the sting of the words hurled at him. Insults can't revoke service. Prejudice can't erase contribution, and suspicion can't nullify loyalty. Those things, dignity, service, belonging, they aren't temporary, they aren't conditional. They endure if we choose to let them. He gestured lightly toward the cameras, as if speaking now to those far beyond the studio. I want every kid watching, every parent, every grandparent who came here with hope in their suitcase, to remember this. No one else gets to define your place in this country if you've claimed it through the work of your hands and the truth in your heart. You are not a guest here. You are a thread in the fabric. Without you, it frays. The air in the room had changed. Even those who had been tense with partisanship seemed caught in the gravity of his words. Patel pressed on. We can argue fiercely about policy. We can disagree on solutions. But if we start deciding that certain Americans are less American because of their names, their skin, their family's point of origin, then we've abandoned the very promise that brought us here in the first place. He let that sit for a long moment before adding, and here's the thing. The promise is worth keeping. For me, for you, for the generations to come. We keep it by remembering that patriotism is not about closing doors. It's about building a house strong enough to welcome and protect everyone inside it. It's about understanding that diversity isn't a threat to our unity. It's the reason we have any unity at all. Patel's voice softened, but his words struck no less sharply. I could have met your insult with anger. I could have thrown something back at you that would have been replayed for the wrong reasons. But I didn't, because I've learned that dignity is the one thing an insult can't touch, unless you hand it over. And I will never hand mine over. Not for politics, not for applause, not for anyone. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Patel leaned back slightly, signaling not retreat, but completion. So, here's the truth I want to leave with all of you. Our Americanness is not measured by who shouts the loudest about it. It's measured by who lives it. Quietly, consistently, and without needing to belittle someone else to feel it in their bones. He paused, letting the cameras drink in the stillness. If tonight reminded us of anything, he concluded, it's that our words can wound, but they can also heal. They can close the door, or they can hold it open. I know which kind of country I want to live in. I know which kind I've been serving all my life. And I hope, when the heat of this moment fades, we'll all choose the same one. The one big enough to hold us all. There was no need to raise his voice at the end. The audience's applause rose in waves, carrying his final words into the living rooms, classrooms, and quiet corners where people were listening for something to believe in again. And that's why this moment will be remembered. What began as a moment meant to wound ended as a lesson the whole country could see. The words, "Go back to India," were meant to draw lines, but Patel's answer erased them, replacing division with a vision of America that belongs to all who claim it through service, sacrifice, and love of country. That is why this night was more than a debate. It was a mirror held up to our national character. If you watched him sit in that chair, steady under the lights, and answer not with fury but with unshakable dignity, you know the power of refusing to be diminished. You know what it feels like to hear someone speak a truth you've carried in your chest for years. That your belonging is not conditional, that no one can revoke the oath you live every day. The title of this story is The Insult. But the legacy of this story is the response. It's the reminder that our identity, our place here, is not a favor we beg for. It is a birthright we honor through action. Every time you stand tall in the face of smallness, you add another chapter to that legacy. If Patel's words lit something in you tonight, don't let it fade when the clip stops playing. Carry it forward. Share this moment with someone who needs to hear it. Be the voice that drowns out the noise with truth. Stand for dignity when it would be easier to stay silent. Subscribe for more stories where courage outshines contempt and principle outweighs insult. Share this so the next person told to go back knows they never left. Join this movement, because a country worth keeping is a country worth speaking up for. And it begins with each of us, right now.